The chamber was a storm disguised as marble and velvet, its chandeliers trembling with the low growl of restless voices. Every seat was taken, every phone raised, the kind of electric anticipation that prickles the back of your neck before a lightning strike. Under the harsh white glow, two figures faced each other across the polished oak bench. One, immovable, shoulders squared, eyes steady, a figure of composure whose calm presence radiated quiet strength. The other, bristling with impatience, fingers drumming, lips curled in a smirk that had fueled countless viral clips. This wasn't just another debate. This was the moment the country had been waiting for. Outside, cameras jostled against glass like waves battering a cliff. Commentators whispered on live streams. Hashtags were already trending, and a hush rolled through the chamber as the moderator's gavel struck once, then twice. Time seemed to slow. The hero's voice was low but resonant, slicing through the tension with the precision of a blade. The villain rolled their eyes, but a tremor flickered at the edge of their jaw, a tiny betrayal broadcast to millions. The audience leaned forward as if gravity itself had shifted. Even those at home could sense the stakes rising with every passing second. The villain attempted a rehearsed barb, words heavy with arrogance, but it landed flat in the supercharged air. A murmur spread, then stilled. All eyes swung back to the hero, who remained silent just long enough to command total attention. In that pause, people across the country held their breath. And then, one statement delivered with a clarity that made the chandeliers quiver, a truth so piercing it cut through the noise like sunlight through storm clouds. Gasps rippled through the room, and a camera flash illuminated the hero's face like a halo. Phones buzzed, journalists typed furiously, and someone whispered, "This changes everything." The villain blinked, momentarily disarmed, and the chamber became a living organism. Murmurs, gasps, and the quiet click of countless record buttons capturing history in real time. Yet even in that moment of revelation, no one could guess how far the consequences would reach. But what happened next would stun everyone watching. Long before the chamber filled with tension and flickering camera lights, the story had been building like a pressure system over the country. Weeks of outrage, headlines, and backroom whispers had pushed the confrontation to this exact flashpoint. Across neighborhoods, in diners, and on sidewalks, people debated the same questions. Who speaks for us? Who stands against us? The hero had become a lightning rod of hope for many: immigrant families, working-class communities, young people who still believed in fairness, while the villain embodied the very forces they feared were erasing their dignity. This was more than a hearing. It was a referendum on the soul of the nation. The seeds were planted months earlier when a policy proposal emerged that would have gutted long-standing protections for vulnerable communities. Commentators framed it as reform, but those living closest to the pain called it what it was: erasure. Town halls erupted, marches spilled into city squares, hashtags turned into movements. The hero, a steady but unassuming public servant, began speaking out with measured words that cut deeper than any shout. Quietly, steadily, their reputation grew, not as a bomb thrower, but as someone who could hold power to account without losing their own humanity. Meanwhile, the villain's media machine spun the story differently. They framed the hero's warnings as overreaction, mocked their background, and pitted neighbor against neighbor. Each insult, each smug dismissal hardened the stakes. The public wasn't just watching, they were choosing sides. Even those who rarely paid attention to politics sensed something consequential in the air. It wasn't about a single law anymore. It was about who gets to define Americanness, who belongs, and who is allowed to speak in rooms where decisions are made. As the date of the confrontation neared, tension bled into every headline. Poll numbers ticked upward for the hero's cause. Students organized watch parties. Churches printed flyers. Families in immigrant enclaves shared the hero's speeches on group chats late into the night. Every detail became symbolic: the setting, the language, even the seating arrangement. By the time the cameras rolled, it wasn't just two individuals facing off. It was two competing visions of the country colliding under the same roof. Inside the chamber, the audience felt the history pressing down. Security was tighter than usual. The air carried the scent of coffee and nerves. The villain exuded confidence, but behind them sat aides clutching notes like life preservers. Across the aisle, the hero waited, hands folded, gaze steady, embodying the quiet dignity that seemed to expand with every second. This wasn't about scoring a soundbite. It was about drawing a line in the sand on behalf of people who rarely saw themselves defended at this level. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones about an inflection point. Commentators online warned of a potential backlash. Yet under all the noise, something simpler pulsed: a collective yearning for fairness, for someone to hold power to account without losing their soul. The hero seemed to understand this, carrying not just facts, but the invisible weight of a million small stories: parents working double shifts, students navigating bias, veterans denied recognition, all packed into the words they were about to speak. And just when everyone thought they knew how it would play out,
long before the cameras converged on the chamber, the antagonist had been constructing their own mythology, a portrait of themselves as the steely defender of traditional values, a guardian against change. Born into privilege, they glided through elite schools where connections mattered more than merit. They learned early how to weaponize charm and outrage, how to spin half-truths into rallying cries. To their supporters, this image was intoxicating. To those living the realities they dismissed, it was salt in an open wound. Over the years, they perfected a performance of toughness that masked a deep reliance on backroom deals and corporate donors whose interests lay far from the people they claimed to represent. Their rise began with a headline-grabbing speech in which they thundered about restoring integrity. Yet behind the curtain, they accepted money from the very industries they accused of corruption. The contradiction wasn't hidden, it was flaunted, cloaked in the confidence that no one would dare call them out. They built an empire on outrage, crafting sound bites designed to go viral, and crafting laws designed to quietly benefit their benefactors. For years, it worked. Opponents stumbled over their audacity, misreading arrogance as strength. This swagger found its clearest expression in their public persona: the dismissive smirk, the cutting one-liners, the carefully staged "got-ya" moments on social media. They framed immigrants as threats, even while their own businesses quietly hired them off the books. They championed family values, while whisper campaigns swirled about their personal betrayals. Each new revelation should have been disqualifying, yet each time they emerged unscathed, fueled by a network of pundits who turned their scandals into proof of their supposed outsider status. Indignation became their armor. Contradiction became their brand. Inside the halls of power, staffers whispered about a pattern of bullying, assistants reduced to tears, colleagues blackballed from minor disagreements. Their arrogance was not just a show for cameras, it was a governing style rooted in domination. This is why, when the hero quietly challenged their most recent proposal, the antagonist responded not with dialogue, but with derision. They assumed, as always, that intimidation would prevail. But this time was different. The country was watching more closely than before, and the stakes had grown too high for theatrics to disguise their motives. In their speeches leading up to the showdown, they mocked the heroes' immigrant heritage, painting them as out of touch, un-American, or radical. These attacks, calculated to stoke division, ignited instead a groundswell of empathy. Across social media, people began sharing their own stories of struggle and belonging, pushing back against the antagonist's narrative. Still, in private, they laughed it off. Their aides assured them the optics would hold, that the audience would tune out identity politics and side with the familiar swagger they had cultivated. They believed their own myth. Yet cracks were forming. Whistleblowers leaked documents showing sweetheart deals and broken promises. Investigations hinted at conflicts of interest. Even some longtime allies began to hedge their praise. The antagonist doubled down, convinced that louder attacks would drown out accountability. They underestimated how deeply the country's mood had shifted, how much people hungered for integrity over spectacle. For every insult they hurled, another grassroots fundraiser sprang up in the hero's name. For every viral clip of derision, a quieter clip circulated of the hero's calm rebuttal, building an alternative narrative brick by brick. Their hypocrisy reached its peak on the eve of the confrontation. In a private reception, they boasted to donors about the legislation they'd torpedoed after cameras left, joking about keeping the base fed. Hours later, they went on national television, hand over heart, promising to defend the very measures they'd mocked in private. By now, staffers were uneasy. Polling was slipping. Journalists were digging deeper. The mask was thinning, but the antagonist couldn't see it. Years of escaping consequences had left them blind to the possibility of a real reckoning. And so, on the day of the showdown, they walked into the chamber cloaked in their trademark bravado. They scanned the audience, searching for cameras first, allies second. Their smile was sharp, but their eyes flickered just briefly when they saw the hero already seated, calm and composed, hands folded as though holding some unspoken power. For the first time, the antagonist felt the faint chill of vulnerability. The room wasn't bending toward them anymore. It was leaning toward something else, something steadier, something they couldn't control. They took their seat, drummed their fingers, rehearsed their barbs. Their supporters filled the gallery with nervous applause, but it lacked the old roar. Somewhere deep down, a whisper of doubt intruded. What if the performance didn't work this time? What if the narrative slipped from their grip? Yet they shrugged it off. They had been here before. They knew how to dominate a stage, how to drown a rival in sound and fury.
Long before the cameras fixed on their face and the nation's pulse quickened at the sound of their name, the hero's life had been shaped by a quiet determination forged in hardship. Born to a family that arrived with little more than suitcases and a belief in possibility, they grew up in a cramped apartment where 3 languages mingled over dinner and every dollar was stretched like thread through a needle. They watched their parents work long shifts, night after night, in jobs few others would take. From this, they learned 2 things. Dignity is not a gift, but a practice, and truth is a force far stronger than spectacle. As a child, they felt the sting of being underestimated. Teachers sometimes mispronounced their name, neighbors made offhand remarks about their family's accents, and classmates questioned whether they belonged. Instead of shrinking, they turned inward, drawing strength from the stories their grandmother told about perseverance under impossible odds. Those stories became the scaffolding of their character, instilling patience and a fierce loyalty to the idea that every person deserves to be seen, not just looked at. In adolescence, they organized their first act of public service almost by accident, a neighborhood cleanup after a factory spill. They watched as families came together to haul debris, plant seedlings, and repaint fences. Something in that day clicked. Community wasn't a slogan, it was action. They began volunteering at local shelters, tutoring younger students, and translating at city council meetings for elders who struggled with English. Each gesture, no matter how small, widened their sense of responsibility. When college came, it was on a patchwork of scholarships and late-night jobs. They studied law, not for prestige, but for defense, the ability to shield the vulnerable from predatory systems. Professors noted their meticulous preparation, their willingness to listen before speaking. Even then, their style was less about the grandstanding speech and more about the precise question that dismantled a faulty assumption. They interned in legal aid clinics, fought eviction cases, and worked pro bono to secure benefits for veterans and immigrants. Slowly, word spread. Here was someone who could stand in a room full of power and not lose their center. Entering public office was never inevitable. They faced smear campaigns that mocked their accent and heritage, donors who dismissed them as too earnest, and opponents who tried to box them into one-dimensional labels. Yet each attack only sharpened their clarity. They ran campaigns rooted in door-to-door conversations, town halls in community centers, and small donor fundraising drives that bypassed the usual machine politics. Their victories were narrow at first, but deeply felt, each one a testament to the possibility of people-powered leadership. In their first term, they championed legislation expanding access to education for immigrant children, a move that enraged their detractors but transformed thousands of lives. They stood shoulder to shoulder with striking workers, marched with grassroots coalitions, and quietly built alliances across divides where it mattered. Even critics admitted their calm demeanor was disarming. They never took the bait of personal insult, preferring to let facts and lived experience anchor their arguments. This composure became their signature, a stillness that drew attention precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the noise of modern politics. But beyond policy, what set them apart was the way they carried themselves in private moments. They remembered names, showed up to funerals, helped interns find housing, and visited shelters without press. Constituents spoke of a person who listened without checking the clock, who returned calls even when cameras were off. They approached leadership not as performance, but as stewardship. Over time, that authenticity built a reservoir of trust, one that would matter more than any headline or endorsement. Their worldview was anchored in a belief that identity is strength, not liability. They spoke often about their parents' sacrifices, about growing up straddling cultures, about learning the difference was not a flaw, but a lens. In speeches, they framed their journey not as exceptional, but as emblematic of countless others who lacked a microphone. By standing tall, they invited others to do the same, transforming private pride into collective power. As the antagonists' attacks grew louder, the heroes' preparation deepened. They read reports late into the night, consulted legal experts, rehearsed their arguments not to land a soundbite, but to ensure airtight precision. They didn't just prepare facts, they prepared themselves emotionally, knowing the antagonist would deploy mockery and insinuation. Friends urged them to fight fire with fire, but they refused. Their strategy was patience, evidence, and a steady presence that could withstand the storm. In the weeks before the showdown, they visited community centers, gathering stories of those who would be most affected by the proposed policy. They carried these stories like talismans, names, faces, small acts of courage, ready to weave them into testimony. Each encounter reminded them why the fight mattered, turning nerves into resolve. They understood that every pause they took, every look of steadiness on camera would be a lifeline for someone at home watching, wondering if dignity could still win in public life. Even their critics began to sense a shift. Pollsters noted an unusual cross-current of support. People who disagreed on policy still admired their restraint and depth. Commentators began framing the upcoming confrontation as a values test, a moment when one person's integrity would meet another's bravado under full national scrutiny. The hero didn't flinch. They had been living this test their whole life. On the morning of the hearing, they arrived before the cameras, walking with measured steps, eyes focused, a quiet confidence radiating like a heartbeat. They were not there to score a point or to humiliate anyone. They were there to speak a truth honed by years of listening and serving, a truth bigger than any single individual. In the green room, aides tried to rehearse possible insults the antagonist might hurl, but the hero simply closed their eyes, breathing in, breathing out, centering themselves in the decades-long arc that had brought them to this room. They entered the chamber carrying not just a folder of evidence, but the invisible weight of 1,000,000 stories. Their presence seemed to change the air itself, an unspoken promise that no matter how loud the insults, no matter how aggressive the performance, dignity would not be drowned out. Their quiet, steady gaze was not merely confidence, but invitation, for the public to imagine a politics rooted in care, for the country to remember its better self.
The chamber that had felt like a sealed vault only hours before now pulsed like a living organism, heat rising with each exchange. Cameras zoomed closer. The clatter of keyboards in the press row sounded like distant rain. Across the bench, the antagonist leaned forward, chin jutting, their smirk curdling into something sharper. They began with familiar jabs, veiled insinuations about loyalty, questions designed to belittle rather than probe. Each phrase landed with the snap of a whip, meant to provoke a reaction. Yet the hero sat motionless, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point beyond the antagonist's performance, as though anchoring themselves to something steadier than the room. Every word from the antagonist seemed to ricochet off the marble walls and echo louder than it had been spoken, amplified by years of resentment and spectacle. They tried to frame the hearing as a trial of patriotism, questioning the hero's heritage, their motives, even their tone of voice. "We're here to talk about facts," the antagonist said, voice dripping with mock civility. "But some people seem more interested in rewriting America." Gasps, murmurs. The audience's mood shifted, the tension snapping like static before a storm. It was no longer a hearing. It was a duel. Reporters scribbled furiously. One aide near the antagonist winced at a particularly cutting remark, knowing the line would look monstrous in replay. The hero finally raised his eyes, not in anger, but in quiet challenge, a gaze that landed like a steadying hand on the country's shoulder. Still, they did not interrupt. Their composure read less like passivity and more like strategy, a gathering of energy before release. In that stillness, the antagonist grew restless, tapping a pen against the desk, flipping through papers as though searching for a sharper blade. The temperature rose again when the antagonist waved a stack of documents, claiming they revealed shocking truths. The flourish played well to cameras, but felt brittle to those in the room. "How do you defend this?" they demanded, stabbing a finger across the aisle. The hero inhaled slowly, a gesture almost invisible but captured by the lenses lining the back wall. On social media, screenshots of that calm breath began trending with captions like, "Poise under fire," and "The look that stops a bully cold." Outside, crowds watching on big screens leaned in, sensing the moment tipping. Every detail heightened the drama. The villain's voice climbed in pitch, their hands chopping the air. They leaned so far forward that the microphone caught their breath. By contrast, the hero's stillness became gravitational, drawing attention without saying a word. Commentators whispering off camera noted the reversal of roles, the aggressor looking defensive, the supposed target becoming unshakable. The longer the hero held silence, the more the antagonist flailed, caught between overconfidence and creeping panic. Then the insults sharpened. The antagonist accused the hero of performing for the cameras, of hiding behind identity, of failing real Americans. Each phrase was meant to slice, but with each, the room's energy shifted further away from outrage and toward disbelief. A few gasps even came from the antagonist's own side. Their aides exchanged worried glances. What had been a show of dominance was veering into self-sabotage. Through it all, the hero finally began to move. Not speaking yet, but sliding a single sheet of paper forward, adjusting the microphone, meeting the antagonist's stare without blinking. That small motion sent a ripple across the chamber, like a flag unfurling before a charge. People sensed something was about to happen. Viewers at home sat forward on couches, phones half raised, ready to capture the moment. Even the moderator hesitated, gavel hovering mid-air, as if instinctively aware of an approaching pivot point. The antagonist noticed the shift too, and for a heartbeat, their voice faltered. They cleared their throat, tried another line of attack, but the force was gone, replaced by a tremor. The hero's composure had become an indictment all its own, a mirror reflecting the antagonist's desperation. The tension reached a peak pitch. Murmurs swelled, the chamber's air turned electric, and even the cameras seemed to tighten their focus, narrowing the world to two faces across a polished desk. It felt like the final seconds before a storm breaks, everyone sensing impact, no one knowing its exact form. The antagonist shuffled their papers, trying to regain momentum, but the stage had already shifted beneath them. Across the country, people watching live streams whispered to friends, "It's about to happen." And in the chamber itself, the silence before the hero spoke became its own kind of power, a pause that vibrated with decades of struggle and the promise of catharsis. But no one could have predicted the next move.
For a heartbeat, the entire chamber existed in suspended animation, like a photograph waiting to be developed. The antagonist's last words still hung in the air, acrid and heavy, but the hero didn't flinch. Instead, they adjusted the microphone a fraction of an inch closer, the small metallic scrape echoing louder than any speech. That single motion, calm, deliberate, drew every camera lens like a magnet. People watching on their phones paused mid-scroll. The hush deepened. It was time. The hero began not with a flourish, but with a question, soft yet steady. When did we decide that fear was more American than fairness? The line cut through the static, not shouted, but spoken with the resonance of conviction. A tremor ran through the chamber. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Wow," without realizing it. The antagonist shifted in their seat, eyes narrowing, hands clasping and unclasping like a metronome gone awry. Then came the first reveal, a series of documents laid out like a quiet ambush. Each sheet bore the seal of an official agency, a timeline, a signature. With each page, the hero built a narrative that reversed the antagonist's claims point by point, calmly citing statutes, emails, and testimony. No rhetoric, no drama, just facts presented with the poise of someone who had done their homework while the other side rehearsed insults. Gasps flickered across the audience as they recognized names and dates, connecting dots the antagonist had tried to scatter. The hero's voice remained level, a river cutting through stone. "You've spoken about protecting the people," they said, looking directly at the antagonist. "But these records show contracts awarded to your donors, protections rolled back for workers, and enforcement targeted at communities who had no lobbyists to shield them." With each word, the antagonist's face paled slightly, the smirk melting into a tight line. The camera caught their jaw clench, a vain flicker at the temple. Their fingers stilled. The hero paused. Silence filled the chamber again, but now it belonged to them. They let the weight of the evidence settle, then continued with a personal note, not about themselves, but about the people whose stories had been silenced. They recounted the veteran denied benefits, the teacher threatened with deportation after 20 years of service, the small business fined for errors the antagonist's allies routinely ignored. Each story landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples moving outward through the room, through the broadcast, through the country. Audience members shifted from skepticism to empathy, some leaning forward as though the hero's words were being spoken directly to them. Even journalists, hardened by years of spin, found themselves scribbling furiously, noting the quiet authority, the absence of spectacle. This was not performance, it was revelation. Hashtags bloomed online within seconds. Hashtag receipts, hashtag facts first, hashtag steady under fire, spreading like sparks across a dry field. The antagonist tried to interject, but the hero simply raised her hand slightly, a gesture of composure rather than dominance. "You've had your say. Now let's deal in truth." The chamber erupted in murmurs. The moderator hesitated, unsure whether to gavel or let history unfold. The hero went on, dismantling the antagonist's talking points with precision, each counterpoint introduced like a chess master revealing a checkmate no one else had seen coming. Then came the emotional pivot. The hero told her own story, not as a resume, but as testimony. Her parents working night shifts, the humiliation of being told they didn't belong, the faith they held anyway in the promise of fairness. "I stand here not to win an argument, but to make sure every child sitting at a kitchen table tonight knows that their worth is not up for debate." The line cut through something. Applause broke out from a corner of the gallery, hesitant at first, then swelling before the gavel brought it to order. On social media, clips of that sentence alone began racking up hundreds of thousands of views. As the speech built, the hero's tone shifted again, back to measured calm, but now charged with unshakable energy. They unveiled one last set of documents, whistleblower testimony directly contradicting the antagonist's core claim. "This isn't my opinion. This is your own staff, under oath." A collective gasp rolled through the room. The antagonist stared at the papers as though they might vanish. Aides behind them exchanged frantic glances, whispering furiously. Cutaway shots showed journalists typing, citizens at watch parties rising to their feet, even some of the antagonist's usual allies looking away. The power dynamic had inverted completely. Where once the antagonist loomed as the aggressor, now they seemed cornered, their bluster exposed as scaffolding around a hollow core. The hero didn't gloat. They simply laid the final page down and looked up, eyes steady. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had just shifted history's axis by inches and made it irreversible. Another pause. The hero inhaled deeply, then closed with words that transcended the moment. "This country is not a stage for cruelty, and it is not a playground for power. It's a promise, Unfinished, imperfect, but worth fighting for. And we fight best when we fight fair. The room stilled, as though the air itself had thickened. For a flicker of time, everyone was connected. Cameras, audience, opponents, allies, all caught in the same held breath. The antagonist tried one last maneuver, muttering about grandstanding and political theater. But the accusation rang hollow. His voice cracked mid-sentence. The contrast was complete. Where the antagonist had arrived brash and loud, now they looked cornered, their gestures stiff, their gaze darting to the exits. The hero, by contrast, seemed to expand, their steadiness now an aura filling the chamber. On social media, the clips became an avalanche. Comment threads filled with people recounting their own stories, thanking the hero for speaking truth to power, tagging friends with, "Watch this." Even news outlets that normally tilted toward the antagonist's side led with headlines about brutal fact-check and calm dismantling. A meme of the hero's raised hand began circulating with captions like, "Let the adults talk," and "Receipts over rhetoric." Inside the chamber, a ripple of something new moved across the room, less like applause and more like recognition. Even those who disagreed on policy could feel it. The hero had taken the oxygen from the antagonist's fire, leaving only smoke. The silence afterward was not empty. It was the sound of power shifting. The hero gathered her paper slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush the moment. She glanced once more at the antagonist, not with triumph, but with the steadiness of someone who understands the difference between victory and vindication. She had done what she came to do: reveal the truth, hold the line, and remind the country of its unfinished promise. And just as she began to step back, the moderator raised her gavel but hesitated, sensing the weight of history still thick in the air. Outside, car horns blared in celebration from spontaneous gatherings. Inside, aides began fielding a storm of calls and messages, the digital echo of a moral earthquake. The reaction in the room and online would change everything.
By the time the hero stepped away from the microphone, the chamber was still vibrating with the echo of their words. It was as if the building itself had absorbed the shock and was slowly exhaling. Journalists scrambled for the exits to file breaking alerts. Interns whispered furiously into phones, and even seasoned lawmakers sat stunned, eyes fixed on the empty chair where the hero had just sat. Outside, however, the reaction was instantaneous, an eruption across millions of screens, a digital thunderclap as the moment leapt from marble halls to the global stage. Within minutes, hashtags were trending worldwide. Hashtag receipts, hashtag fight fair, and hashtag poise under fire, stacked on top of each other like banners on a march. TikTok loops replayed the hero's calm hand gesture as though it were a sacred signal. Twitter threads dissected every line of their takedown. Instagram reels stitched the hero's final words with music that swelled like a movie trailer. Memes proliferated, the antagonist's shocked expression side by side with the hero's steady gaze, captions reading "truth greater than bluster" or "dignity wins." It wasn't just fandom, it was participation, a shared experience binding millions together in real time. Cable news anchors who'd spent years hosting both sides panels broke script to call the confrontation one of the most devastating rebuttals in memory. Late-night comedians paused their monologues to play unedited clips of the exchange. On podcasts and radio shows, callers described watching from classrooms, cafes, or hospital break rooms, wiping tears of vindication as the hero spoke. Celebrities reposted the clip with messages of solidarity, actors, athletes, and musicians alike, many sharing their own stories of being underestimated, of finding courage in the face of arrogance. A groundswell of grassroots donations flooded into causes the hero had championed. Each small contribution, a digital nod of "we saw you, we're with you."
In immigrant neighborhoods, watch parties had turned into impromptu celebrations. Restaurant owners streamed the moment on flat screens above counters, customers raising cups of coffee as if in a toast. Students painted the hero's quote on cardboard signs. Faith leaders worked it into sermons. Even some who had opposed the hero's politics admitted on air to being moved by the calm force of the truth-telling. The speech was no longer a political event. It had become a cultural touchstone, the kind that people would remember as where I was when I first saw it. Meanwhile, the antagonist's world began to crumble under scrutiny. Clips of their flustered reactions and contradictory statements were remixed into viral compilations titled The Unraveling. Former allies quietly scrubbed endorsements from websites. Editorial boards issued editorials demanding accountability. Poll numbers shifted overnight. The swagger that seemed untouchable now looked brittle, a performance in collapse. While the antagonist tried to spin the exchange as political theater, their words rang hollow against the tidal wave of evidence and the collective memory of millions who had witnessed the moment live. Commentators spoke of the permission slip effect, the way the hero's calm defiance emboldened others to speak up. Workers in unrelated industries began tweeting their own mic drop moments against unfair bosses. Teachers shared clips with students as an example of speaking truth to power. Hashtags morphed into campaigns, campaigns into donations, and donations into coordinated volunteer drives. What had begun as a single confrontation now radiated outward, touching lives and reshaping conversations far beyond the walls of the chamber. Even abroad, international outlets ran the footage with subtitles, framing it as a parable of democracy under pressure. Editorial cartoons appeared in European papers, showing the hero holding a small flame against a looming shadow. Human rights groups issued statements praising the courage on display, citing it as a model for leaders everywhere. Suddenly, the narrative had shifted from a local skirmish to a global lesson in accountability. Yet the hero themselves remained measured. In the hours after, while staffers tried to corral a flood of media requests, they issued only a brief statement: gratitude for the chance to speak and a call for people to stay engaged beyond the viral moment. This humility deepened the public's respect. Comment threads filled with users saying they felt seen, represented, or finally proud. It wasn't just admiration, it was belonging, a sense of collective stake in something larger than an individual win. Back in the chamber, as security guided onlookers out and reporters shouted questions, the antagonists sat alone for a moment, staring at their phone as notification after notification buzzed with headlines unfavorable to them. The imbalance that had once seemed permanent had flipped in a single afternoon. Aides avoided eye contact. The marble floor, so long their stage, now felt like an arena of judgment. Still, amid the celebration and outrage, a deeper undercurrent stirred. Analysts warned that backlash could be brewing, that entrenched powers rarely yielded without counterattack. Social platforms churned with speculation about what might come next: investigations, resignations, perhaps even new legislation. The moment had cracked something open, but no one yet knew what would flow through the fissure. And as the hero prepared for their next move, their supporters and detractors alike found themselves asking the same thing. How far would the ripples reach? Was this a single flash of courage, or the dawn of a lasting shift? Headlines speculated, talk shows debated, and living rooms buzzed with late-night conversations about what the confrontation meant for the future. But as the dust settled, one question remained. When the hero finally returned to the podium the following morning, the chamber's atmosphere had shifted from frenzy to reverence. The floor was quiet, the cameras already trained, but this time there was no sense of combat, only expectation. The hero stood not as a politician or a litigant, but as a living embodiment of the idea that truth can outlast spectacle. They began not with victory laps or statistics, but with a single phrase, "This is bigger than any one of us." The words floated across the hall like a benediction, drawing murmurs of assent even from corners that had once been hostile. They spoke of dignity as a practice rather than a posture, a commitment to meet anger with steadiness and hate with persistence. They reminded the chamber of the immigrant dock workers and the Midwestern teachers, of elders who had marched before cameras existed, of the ordinary people whose quiet courage built the country brick by brick. Service, the hero said, isn't about where you come from, but what you choose to stand for. Each sentence seemed to untie a knot inside the room, loosening the tightness left by days of conflict. Faces softened, a few eyes welled with tears. Even the antagonist's remaining allies shifted uneasily, sensing a tide too deep to resist. As the hero spoke, screens across the country filled with closed captions of their words. On buses, in diners, in hospital waiting rooms, people leaned in, nodding, murmuring, yes. It felt like a collective exhale after a long, bruising hold of breath. For months, maybe years, audiences had been conditioned to expect only division and humiliation. Yet here was someone daring to offer a different currency: mutual respect, steady resolve, and the belief that a single person's courage could reset the terms of engagement. The hero's speech reached its crescendo when they reframed the entire confrontation not as a personal battle, but as a mirror for the nation. The question isn't whether we win a headline, they said, but whether we rise to our own ideals, whether we let cynicism decide our future, or dignity. Applause broke out in a place where applause was technically discouraged. It began as a ripple, then rolled like a wave through the chamber. Outside, crowds erupted, honking car horns, waving flags not of party but of principle. On social media, hashtags pivoted from the clash itself to words like "new standard" and "rise above." Reporters noted how the hero didn't just dismantle an opponent, they built something in its place, a vocabulary of hope. Their message invited everyone in, not just allies, but skeptics, reframing participation as patriotism rather than partisanship. Even some of the antagonist's longtime defenders found themselves quoting the hero's lines on morning shows, acknowledging that the confrontation had reset the bar for public discourse. The tone had shifted from humiliation to elevation. In homes where parents had watched the takedown with their kids, this follow-up speech became a teaching moment. Teachers replayed clips in classrooms, asking students what dignity means. Community centers held watch and discuss nights. Faith leaders wove the hero's phrasing into sermons about courage and humility. Instead of fading into another viral clip, the moment began hardening into a story of renewal, a parable about how justice and empathy can coexist with strength. And the hero closed not with a call to division, but with an invitation. If you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or told you don't belong, know this: you are the heartbeat of this country, and the fight for dignity is yours as much as mine. The words hung in the air like a pledge. It was not just catharsis, it was a call to become custodians of a higher civic standard. People watching at home felt their own posture straighten, as if receiving a charge to carry forward. Then came the final line, the one destined to live beyond the broadcast. The hero looked directly into the camera and said, "Dignity over hate, service over ancestry, justice over corruption. That is our true inheritance." The chamber, the country, and the comment threads seemed to pause on that declaration. It was more than a slogan. It was an orientation, a way of being that could outlast any news cycle. And in that moment, a new standard was set.
As the echoes of that historic moment faded, one truth became impossible to ignore. What began as a confrontation had transformed into a defining statement about who we are and what we stand for. The title of this video isn't just a headline, it's a reminder of the instant when composure and courage eclipsed arrogance and spectacle. You've witnessed how a single voice, rooted in dignity, can pierce through the noise and reset the conversation for an entire nation. But the meaning of this moment doesn't end inside those marble walls. It lives in every living room, classroom, and phone screen where people like you felt that jolt of recognition, the sense that someone finally spoke not just at power, but for you. And it's in your hands now. By subscribing, sharing, and staying engaged, you're not simply boosting a channel. You're joining a movement that insists on truth, empathy, and justice as non-negotiables. Think about the friends, family members, or coworkers who feel unheard. Imagine them seeing this same clip, feeling the same spark you felt. That's the ripple effect. One click, one share, one conversation at a time. If you've ever doubted whether your voice matters, let this be your proof. It does. The Hero's Stand is an invitation for all of us to keep holding leaders accountable and lifting one another up. So don't let this be the last stop. Subscribe now, share this story, and carry its message into your own circles. Every person who joins in helps build the next chapter of dignity over hate, service over ancestry, justice over corruption. The story isn't over, and you're part of what comes next.